Well, good morning, everyone. It's so lovely to be here. It's my first time spending some time in Dublin. I've passed through before, and it's a beautiful city, and we had a really good time last night. I'm here with my husband. So thank you for the hospitality, and thank you to the Equality and Rights Alliance for the invitation. My theme this morning is about tackling inequality through economic justice, that economic justice has to be at the heart of any movement for equality. And I was going to start with this quote from the Equal Rights Trust, which is one of their principles of equality. As poverty may both be a cause and consequence of discrimination, measures to alleviate poverty should be coordinated with measures to combat discrimination in the pursuit of full and effective equality. And I will argue vice versa, that tackling discrimination must involve tackling poverty and financial hardship. But first, I really want to give credit to the Equality and Rights Alliance for all the work that they have done since they were set up and the reasons that they were set up, and for all the work that they are doing now and the research that they have just produced as well. It is amazing to me how many similarities there are with the position in England with the development of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. Because when it was first mooted around 2002, 2003, I was one of the few organisations that said, no way, it's not going to work, because you cannot bring all those equality groups together without an even platform of legislation, without sufficient resources, and without the enforcement powers that it needs. And only when you have those things in place could you talk about bringing it together in a unified body. Unfortunately, we were also very, very concerned at the demise of the Commission for Racial Equality, the Disability Rights Commission, and the Equal Opportunities Commission, because all of those bodies had cut a seam in looking at equality for symbolic and psychological reasons. They were very important to those communities. And in particular, the Disability Rights Commission had made a great deal of headway when it was decided that they would be merged. So we were really concerned. And unfortunately, some of those concerns have now come to fruition. And I don't know if you are aware, but earlier this year, many of the high-profile commissioners left the EHRC because of malfunctions in the organisation and in the leadership. One of the problems that I had was that very few of those commissioners who left were willing to stand up and speak openly about some of the problems with the Commission. And they kind of left it to NGOs and to civil society. In fact, I had approaches to say, would you lead the charge on why the things have gone wrong with the EHRC? And my response was, well, why is it that you haven't listened to NGOs and civil society prior to this? And when your positions are jeopardised and you now want to leave the Commission, now you're coming to us to fire your bullets for you and be front line. That's not right. If you're prepared to stand up and take a position on any of those bodies, then you must be prepared to fire bullets and receive bullets. And so that was my response to them. In addition, at the moment in England, there is something being proposed called the Equality Bill, which now, the idea behind it was to bring all of the legislation that exists on equality together and have everything even. The problem is the times we're in, and the government at the moment is saying openly that they want a light touch bill, that they don't want to alienate the middle ground. Now, of course, the question with that is, what about alienating the people who are discriminated against? What about the burden on them? And the problem with that equality bill is that in very many respects, it's a retrogressive act. So, for example, where a previous requirement of the Race Relations Amendment Act and the Disability Rights Act was about creating schemes, every authority in England and Wales had to have an equality scheme, that will now be gone if the proposals go through. And the proposal is that instead public authorities will set their own objectives, and they only have to set objectives on two grounds. So they could completely choose which equalities they want to go for. So they could, if they decided, for example, that they only wanted to deal with race and gender, they could completely ignore disability. That to me is not acceptable, and we're going backwards rather than forwards. So where we thought a single equality frame would be helpful, it's actually making things much worse than it was before. In addition to that, we had a phenomenon, which I think is a phenomenon. I can't understand why people are not more concerned about this. John Denham, who is the Minister for Communities, in July, 1st of July this year, said to a meeting of the Fabian Society that he thought the ideal of egalitarianism was over, was dead. Now, if a socialist government can't believe in egalitarianism, what is the point of having any socialism? Because for me, it was the individual ethic promoted by Thatcher and Reagan which caused the financial hardship that we're in. It was the view that individuals and individual corporations should go for creating wealth, because if they created wealth, there would be a trickle-down factor and everybody would benefit, the economy would benefit. We now know, of course, that that didn't happen, that the greed set in, and it was malfunctioning, mistimed, greedy practices which led to discriminatory and unfair lending practices and the financial crisis that we're in. And the irony of what John Denham was saying was that it is very often the poor, most often, the poor that feel the worst effects of those kind of practices, because it is the poor that get the highest interest rates and the lowest credit scores, and the ones that find it most difficult to access at least the banks and the financial institutions. So it was those supposedly trusted institutions that sold them down the river. So John Denham's speech, to me, was a slap in the face for the poor and disadvantaged. Inequality costs us all, not just in terms of being damaging to the economy, but also because of the counterproductive effect it has on social inclusion, civic participation and democracy. How can you, if you are poor, be integrated if you cannot afford to move to another area because you'd have to buy a house somewhere else? How can you choose better education and schools for your children if you're caught by a policy of having to go to a school in your particular area? You'd have to move. So social inclusion is always affected by levels of poverty, which then makes me smile, although it's not funny, about when people talk about integration and cohesion, because you can't have it. You can't have social mobility or social integration without economic mobility and economic integration. So that's why it has to be at the heart of it. The economic recession has led to reduced lending and reduced spending, and that's combined to further marginalise and polarise poor communities. We're only just recovering from the last recession of the 80s, and I think it will be those same communities hardest hit by this recession. This financial crisis has resulted in £140 billion in England being paid back into banks and financial institutions, and that's had a profound effect on the wider economy. It means that there'll be less public money available for things like education and health. And given the reliance of low and moderate income households on public services, they are the ones that are going to feel those cuts worst. So that's why it's really important that we pay attention to economic recovery. One of the problems across the UK is that we have a great difficulty in assessing whether the banks and financial institutions and other corporates have actually got fair lending practices or fair monetary practices at all, because we don't have any data. They are not required by legislation, as they are in the US, to provide that information. So, for example, in the US, they have something called the Community Reinvestment Act. And under that act, unless you can show that your lending practices are fair, you get a very low Community Reinvestment Act rating. Now, we know that hasn't always worked, but we can learn from those mistakes in the US. And I would call for a Community Reinvestment Act, both in England and in Ireland, which is led and organised by NGOs and civil society. The call for a Community Reinvestment Act must be framed by civil rights organisations. If practices discriminate against a particular neighbourhood or group, it must affect the ratings. And in turn, those financial institutions would not be allowed to expand or develop their business sectors until their CRA rating went up.